All right, everybody. This video is going to finish up book 2 of the Nicomachean Ethics. Not going to cover everything, obviously. I'm getting book 2 knocked out in 2 videos, and it took, like 5 or 6 videos for book 1. But once you have the foundation, my thought is that you can move a little quicker through the rest of it. All right, so this is about feelings and the mean. Mean here is average, right? Not, being mean to people or hurting people's feelings. It's about the relationship between what Aristotle has to say about feelings and about what has come to be known as the doctrine of the mean. Sometimes, incorrectly, called the principle of moderation or doctrine of moderation. I'll get to that in a minute. But the first fundamental point to realize, and this is going to sound weird to a lot of you, it's one of the ways in which Aristotle is very different from modern moral theorists, so much so that there are some scholars who think that Aristotle doesn't really have a moral theory at all, that Aristotle's not offering a moral theory the way that the 2 later authors we're going to cover in this course are. We'll see. But here's what Aristotle thinks. Virtue is not concerned only with action. It is concerned with action. So a virtuous person will tend to perform certain kinds of actions in certain kinds of scenarios. Get back to a little later, maybe even in a separate video, what Aristotle has to say about which actions those are. But it's true that virtue is a disposition to behave in certain ways, but very importantly, maybe even more importantly for Aristotle, virtue is a disposition to have certain kinds of feelings. So we'll say virtue is a disposition to behavior or action and feelings. So Aristotle thinks a virtuous person will have certain kinds of feelings. And remember that the life of virtue is just the life of reason in action. And so what Aristotle's saying is a rational person will have certain kinds of feelings. And this is one of the ways in which Aristotle is very different in his approach and his default assumptions than most people nowadays. Nowadays, it's very common to think that reason is one thing, or rationality is one thing, and emotion is another. And that rationality and emotions are like 2 different parts of your mind that don't overlap. There's an emotional response to a thing, and there's a rational response to something. And that in some sense they're in conflict even, that the emotional part of you will get different answers and push to go in a different direction than the rational part of you. For Aristotle, that wasn't true. It's also not really true for Plato either. This opposition between reason and emotion is not something the ancients went in for much. According to Aristotle, a rational person will have certain kinds of emotional responses, and that to fail to have certain kinds of emotional responses is to fail to be fully rational. And so that's odd just to start with. That's odd from our contemporary perspective. But also keep in mind that to the extent that this is a moral theory or an ethical theory that they're offering, they're telling you what to do. Right? They're telling you this is how you ought to behave, this is how you ought to be, this is the kind of person you ought to be. Which means there's some sense in which these authors, Plato and Aristotle, think that you have an obligation to feel certain ways. And that if you fail to have certain kinds of feelings in response to certain kinds of situations, then you're failing to do what you should. You're irrational, but you're also in some sense immoral or unethical by failing to have certain feelings. What we'll see is there's a big contrast between Plato and Aristotle on the one hand and later thinkers like Kant. But the problem here is not just that it's not modern, it's that it can seem like this means that we're under obligations that we can't perform at will, right? So when someone says you have an obligation to perform a certain kind of action, you might not perform that action, but it always might seem to you you could have. So if you're in a situation where you have to lie or tell the truth, right? Someone asks you, did you turn in this form when I asked you to turn in the form? And you think to yourself, oh no, I didn't turn in that form. But you face the choice of either saying you did, in which case the person who asked you the question, your boss presumably, goes to find someone else whose fault it is, or admit that you didn't, right? You face that choice. Now, you might think, I'm under an obligation to tell the truth. And even if I don't tell the truth, I could have told the truth, right? Because it's an action, because we think our actions follow from our decisions. It seems like, well, even when we fail to do the right thing, where the right thing is some action we're supposed to perform, we have it within our power to do that thing. And a lot of people think that that's a fundamental idea about morality, that whatever we ought to do, we should be able to do. Or in other words, they accept a principle, sometimes called ought implies can. So if it's the case that you ought to do something, it has to be within your ability to do it. When it comes to action, I'm sure Plato and Aristotle would have been fine with this if you put it out there, right? We can't say that someone ought to perform some action that they're completely unable to perform, right? So if you are unable to swim and you see someone drowning out in the ocean, no one should say you ought to go into the ocean and rescue that person. To be like, I can't. Saying you can't isn't an excuse for not doing it. It's not like, I know I failed, but here's why I failed. Please don't blame me for it. It's to say that you can't swim is just to say, that's not my job, right? I can't be demanded to do something I'm unable to do. So the ought implies can principle makes sense when it comes to action, but when you apply it to feelings, then Plato and Aristotle are probably going to think, well, no, it's not true. There's lots of things you ought to do that maybe you can't do. Because as we're all aware of, or hopefully we're all aware of, our feelings are not entirely under our control. And in fact, our initial feelings we have in response to things are almost entirely outside of our control. Maybe not 100% outside of our control, but almost entirely outside of your control. There are people who say things, silly things, foolish things, like it's your decision to become angry, right? When you get angry at something like, well, that's your decision to become angry. It's like, no, it's not. That's not how anger works. Anger is immediate. You can choose whether you're going to express your anger. You can choose whether you're going to indulge in your anger. But you can't choose whether something makes you angry. If someone steps on your foot, right, it's not as though the decision, right, occurred, well, the decision is presented to you. Shall I become angry or not? Or I could become angry or I could not. If I do become angry, it might cause a problem. If I don't become angry, maybe it lets them walk all over me. That's not how life works, right? The anger is immediate. You then have decisions to make about, whether to go all in on it, to start screaming at the person for stepping on your foot or something like that. But the anger itself is not. Fear is not, right? Arachnophobes don't look at a spider and consistently decide to become afraid. They're just afraid, right? Now, I say not entirely under our control rather than entirely outside of our control, because there are things you can do to regulate your emotional reactions. All of us have some control over some aspects of our emotional life. Not immediate control, like you can't just decide, I shall never become angry again. But there are people who can train themselves so that they become angry less, or that when they become angry, they don't become quite as angry as once they did, right? You can train yourself to stop feeling fear in certain situations, or to feel it less so it's manageable. But that isn't the same way we act, right? It's not like you wake up in the morning and you say, I'm going to try, right, to not lie so much. You could just not lie, right? Every time you're faced with a decision, you could just decide, no, not going to lie, right? It's within your power to just decide it and do it when it comes to your action, or at least that's how we normally think of it. But your feelings are not. And it looks like Aristotle and Plato, although Plato didn't make it nearly as explicit, it's not central to Plato's view that the virtuous person has certain kinds of emotional reactions. It is true that they have certain kinds of emotional reactions, and we know that from what he has to say about spirit. So the spirited part of your soul is the part of your soul that has a certain range of emotional reactions, like anger, shame, pride, things like that. But Aristotle makes it central. It's defining of virtue that you have certain feelings. And this is part of what's going on with the difference between the continent and the incontinent person on the one hand, and the virtuous person on the other. The virtuous person will have the right set of emotional reactions to things, right? When a virtuous person is faced with a scary situation, they won't have to master their fear, Aristotle thinks. They won't have an inappropriate amount of fear that they then try to get under control. They will just not be more afraid than they should be. They will have the proper amount of that feeling. Whereas the continent person will presumably be too afraid. Right? They will spend all their time thinking about the danger, and then they'll try to like overcome that. And if they're continent or self-controlled, then they'll manage to do it. They'll manage to stand firm in the face of whatever's scaring them, despite their overabundance of fear. And the incontinent person will try to master their fear but fail. So for Aristotle, feelings are just as important as actions when it comes to virtue. And that makes sense when you think about what he's saying virtue provides you. He thinks a life of virtue is a life of true blessed happiness. And it would be odd, and I think we can all appreciate this even with our modern sensibilities, it would be odd to come up with an account of what a blessedly happy life is like that just didn't mention the emotions at all. Right? Aristotle's going to want the way you behave and the way you feel and the way you think to all work together harmoniously in the same way that Plato wanted all the parts of your soul to work together harmoniously. So Aristotle thinks you have an obligation to feel certain feelings. And that's going to help us understand what's going on with the doctrine of the mean. All right, this brings us now to the doctrine of the mean. I'm going to explain to you a belief, or a different doctrine rather, often attributed to Aristotle, that is superficially similar to what he actually thinks, the actual doctrine of the mean, but is importantly different as well. And this is the idea summed up in the phrase, everything in moderation. The idea is everything you might want to do is okay, a little or an immoderate amount, but you can take it too far. And for a lot of things, this is reasonable. Right? So drinking alcohol. Drinking alcohol is not bad in itself. It can get very bad if you do too much of it, and so you should drink alcohol in moderation. You shouldn't, or it's at least not ideal, to avoid drinking alcohol ever, because you can do it a little bit and be safe and get the benefits out of it. But it is the kind of thing you can take too far. Sex is like this, right? If you are having sex with everyone you come across, that's a problem. But you shouldn't, so the idea goes, completely abstain because it takes from you one of the good things in life. Exercise is good in moderation, right? You can exercise too much. This is actually an example Aristotle really likes to use. You can exercise too much and ruin your body by overdoing it, right? So the people who like go on marathons every week, right? And Tough Mudders and things like that, or the CrossFit people, right? Aristotle would say, but you shouldn't never exercise. That's crazy. Right? So the idea is everything is good in moderation. And this can seem like what Aristotle is saying in the middle books or middle chapters of book 2. But it's not what he's saying. And before I tell you what he is saying, I want you to think a little bit about this principle, everything in moderation, because it has a superficial air of plausibility to it. But it's deeply implausible. Like it's wrong, right? There's not many things that I'm really confident are just wrong in ethics, but this is just wrong, right? There are some things that should never be done in moderation. Some things because they're always bad, no matter how much you do them, right? Even one time is bad. And some things because you need to go all the way on it, or you're failing terribly. So as an example of the first kind of thing, sexual assault isn't good in moderation. You should never, ever do it. Murder is not good in moderation. You should never, ever do it. Right? There are some kinds of actions that you should just never, ever do. It's not like it's okay to do it a little, but you take it too far. Right? It's that it should never be done. And there's something similar true of feelings. Not the emotions themselves, but having certain kinds of emotional reactions to certain situations. You shouldn't ever have at all. If you watch someone torturing a child, you shouldn't feel a moderate amount of enjoyment. Right? You should feel no enjoyment whatsoever. If you feel any enjoyment, there's something deeply wrong with you. If you see a child smile, you shouldn't be moderately happy for them, right? You shouldn't be like, it's nice, right? You should be fully happy, right? If you see your child succeed in life, you shouldn't like be, well, that's okay, right? That's wrong, right? You shouldn't be reining that in. You should be going all the way in. So everything in moderation is only plausible if you don't really mean everything, which then makes it some things in moderation. So sometimes you shouldn't overdo it, and then that's no longer a principle that tells you anything interesting. Right? Everything in moderation is false. There are plenty of things that in moderation are horrible, and everyone should recognize this. For a long time, people thought this is what Aristotle believed. And consequently, I think Aristotle's reputation suffered as a result, because there's this principle that if you think about it for 5 minutes, you're like, oh, yeah, that makes sense. But if you think about it for another 5 minutes, it's like, oh no, right? That's no good. Luckily, it's not what he's saying. The doctrine of the mean, and the reason I'm covering it in this video about what Aristotle's attitudes towards feelings were, is essentially about feelings you have in relation to something, in relation to situations. And it's related to that distinction between the four kinds of people: the virtuous, the vicious, the continent, and the incontinent. It's a way of understanding what's going on with those people. And here's what Aristotle thinks. So we'll talk about the doctrine of the mean. The doctrine of the mean says basically this. Wow, terrible handwriting. For every virtue, there is a corresponding emotion. And it doesn't really have to be one. At times, Aristotle seems to suggest there's just one emotion for every virtue, that every virtue has its characteristic emotion. But sometimes even he himself recognizes that there's more than one emotion in play for a given virtue. And so we should be open to the idea that there's more than one emotion related to courage. In fact, this is an example where Aristotle, despite sometimes sounding like he means there's one emotion for every virtue, clearly has two. So the two emotions are caution and confidence, a feeling of caution and a feeling of confidence. You might think those are opposites, but Aristotle doesn't think of it that way. Aristotle thinks the courageous person will have the appropriate amount of courage and confidence. Caution and confidence. So what next? For every virtue, there's a corresponding emotion. For temperance, there's sort of a desire for physical pleasure. For courage, there's caution or confidence. For justice, there's an attitude towards gain, right? A desire for gain. For piety, there's reverence. There's all sorts of these things, right? And what Aristotle is saying in the doctrine of the mean is that the emotions that go along with virtue come in degrees. You can have more or less of an emotion. And that for every virtue, there is this spectrum of emotional response. And there's always, for each one of these emotions that goes along with a virtue, there's always too little and too much of that emotional reaction. And that the virtuous person will find the mean. They'll find the happy medium. So this is not about how we ought to behave. The doctrine of the mean does not centrally concern itself with forms of action, right? So he's not saying for every virtue there's a kind of action and that one should be done moderately. That would lead to the same absurdities that the everything in moderation view did, right? So if you were to say that, like you would say the action that goes along with courage is fighting, so you should always fight a moderate amount. It's like, no, sometimes you shouldn't fight. And if you are going to fight, you should really be fighting hard, right? Because you should try to win that fight. You should either not fight or you should fight really hard. You shouldn't fight moderately, right? But he's not saying that. He's saying there's an emotion that goes with it. And every emotion can go wrong in one of two ways, or in two ways. It can go wrong by being insufficient or being excessive. Now, he's not saying in every particular occasion you have the moderate amount of that emotion. What he's saying is you have a certain disposition over time to feel certain things. And that disposition that's extended over time can either be excessive or deficient. So let's take anger. Right? Sometimes you should get angry. When you're mistreated, you should be angry. Someone who never got angry, even when they were mistreated, someone who never responded to being insulted or bullied or attacked with any kind of anger, would be guilty of having too little anger, deficient anger. And that would correspond to a vice. I'm not sure that Aristotle has a name for this vice, but you can think of this as the kind of character trait that goes along with a kind of self-respect. A self-respecting person will not respond to being insulted, attacked, degraded with no emotion at all. Right? That would be a way to not value yourself properly, to not care about yourself enough. However, if you lose your temper at the drop of a hat, if somebody looks at you funny so you decide you're going to beat the crap out of them, well, then you've got too much anger. And there's somewhere in between. So for every virtue, there's a corresponding emotion. For every emotion, that emotion can come in degrees. And there are people who have too little of that emotion or too much of that emotion. They have rather deficient tendencies to feel that emotion or excessive tendencies to feel that emotion. And you should try to avoid those two mistakes. So what Aristotle's trying to do is identify virtues for you by talking about the feelings that go along with them, and then pointing out that for every one of those feelings, you can understand different ways of failing to be a virtuous person as excess or deficiency. He's not saying that in every case, you should have a moderate amount of emotion. You should have the amount of emotion appropriate for that situation, right? So if somebody looks at you funny, right, you should feel maybe a little twinge of anger, like, why are you looking at me like that? But you shouldn't go any farther than that, right? Whereas if somebody comes up to you and spits in your face and says that you're trash, you shouldn't feel like hey, what's the matter with you? Right? Nor should you go into a murderous rage, right? If someone spits in your face, you shouldn't immediately try to curb stomp them, right? You should, well, especially right now, it's April 2020, coronavirus is everywhere. If somebody spits in your face, you should call the cops. You should make sure they get away from you. If you need to use physical force to do that and you're able to, might as well, but you shouldn't like kill them. Whereas if somebody comes up to you and tries to murder you, right, you should have the full angry reaction. All your passion should be engaged, right? Because otherwise you're not going to defend yourself properly. So different circumstances call for different amounts of emotion. And in each one of those circumstances, in almost all those circumstances, you can do too much or too little. Right? This is Aristotle's way of trying to give us an account of what's going on with each individual virtue as a guide to what a virtue is. He is not trying to tell you, in particular, in every situation, how you ought to behave. He's telling you, when you think about how should I feel about something, you should always think about how you feel, not in a particular case, but over the course of your whole life, in relation to an excess or deficiency of that emotion. What he's not doing, this is very important, because this is going to contrast him and Plato, honestly, with later thinkers, Mill and Kant, who are coming up. What he's not doing is trying to provide you a rule that identifies the correct action for you in every situation. Aristotle doesn't think such a rule is possible. That's something I'm going to cover in the next video. I do want to give you a little background, a little context for the doctrine of the mean to let you understand why Aristotle thinks it is important to say. And the reason he thinks it's important to say is even by Aristotle's time, there were already schools of ethical thought coming up or starting to develop, which Aristotle would have thought were basically recommending excess or deficient emotion. So there was a school of thought actually coming from a student of Socrates's, a guy named Antisthenes, that were called the Cynics. The Cynics were convinced that the only thing that was important was virtue and nothing else mattered. And as a result, they flagrantly violated social norms. So they would have sex in public and masturbate in public and things like that. And not because they wanted to, because according to them, the pleasure that came from sexual activity was of no value at all because it wasn't virtue. And according to the Cynics, virtue was the only thing of any value. But just to show people how worthless social conventions were. The Cynics didn't last long, as you could probably understand. Nobody really wanted to be associated with them. But Cynic thought turned into, over time, Stoicism. And the Stoics, I won't go into everything the Stoics believed about ethics. There's a lot of Stoic ethical thought. It's probably the longest lasting ancient ethical doctrine in terms of its popularity. But the Stoics had an attitude towards emotion, which basically said emotions were irrational. The Stoics are actually, in many ways, the source for our modern idea that there's something fundamentally irrational about emotions. The Stoics thought emotions were irrational, and so you should always try to suppress them, or at least some Stoic thinkers thought this. That you should try to prevent yourself from having strong emotional reactions ever. And if you couldn't stop yourself from having the strong emotional reaction, you should never indulge that emotional reaction by acting on it. Aristotle was aware of this kind of theory developing. And according to Aristotle, that's just someone like wholeheartedly endorsing a vice, right? It's the vice of being insensible, of lacking proper sensitivity, right? To give an example of how extreme this could get, the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius, who wrote one of the most famous works on Stoic ethics called the Meditations, said that every night before he went to bed, he told himself that his children would die and he would not be there in the morning, so that if it happened, if he woke up to find his children dead, he would be prepared for it and wouldn't have a strong emotional reaction to it. And that's horrifying. Right. Aristotle's reaction to that would have been like, no, that's not the way you ought to behave. Right. That's a natural, healthy human response to loss. The sadness you feel is the right feeling. Right? Because in general, Aristotle's whole approach towards ethics is that in being ethical, we're just being natural. Right? This attempt to restrain your emotions, to suppress them, to try to not feel anything, or if you feel anything, to write it off as some irrational part of yourself that should be ignored, is to deny part of your nature. Similarly, to indulge every emotion, right? To just follow your feelings wherever they go, right? Would have been to Aristotle to also deny a part of your nature, the rational part of your nature. Virtue is about a harmony, a harmonious relationship between what you rationally think and what you feel. The way you get that is, again, habit. Right? Habit is how you come to cultivate the proper emotional sensitivities and the proper emotional reactions to things. And it's reason that tells you what the proper emotional reactions to things are. So it's reason that tells you what you ought to do and how you ought to feel in any given situation. And you might be wondering at this point, like, well, is Aristotle ever going to tell us? Like, if the doctrine of the mean was not the principle that everything in moderation, if it's not some rule that tells you how to behave, is he ever going to tell us the rules? Is he ever going to give us any moral rules to follow? The answer to that is going to be no. We'll explore that in a future video.